The morning I signed the papers on the Muskok cottage, I poured myself a coffee, sat on the back deck, and watched the loons out on the water for a long time without saying anything to anyone. There was nobody there to say anything to anyone. There was nobody there to say anything to. That was fine. After everything that had happened, the quiet felt like something I had earned. My name is Frank. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years building a small plumbing supply company out of nothing in Barrie, Ontario, sourcing fittings and copper pipe for contractors across Simcoe County, running invoices on a second-hand computer, driving the delivery truck myself on days when my one employee called in sick. I was not a glamorous man. I wore the same kind of flannel shirt my father wore. I packed a sandwich for lunch. I drove a Ford that I kept for 10 years before trading it in. I had a son named Keith. I loved him the way a man loves the thing he worked hardest for. His mother, my wife Sandra, died when Keith was 19. It was a brain aneurysm. She was here on a Thursday and gone by Saturday, and the world never quite looked the same after that. Keith and I leaned on each other through the first year. I thought we had come out the other side of the grief closer than before. Then he met Renata. I want to be careful how I describe Renata, because I spent a long time being furious at her, and I have since had to ask myself how much of what I saw was real and how much was the jealousy of a father watching his son choose someone else to center his life around. I think what I saw was mostly real. She was smart in the way that certain people are smart, always calculating, always running numbers in the back of her mind, always smiling with her teeth, while her eyes figured out what you were worth to her. She was not cruel to Keith. She simply had a very clear picture of what she wanted, and Keith, gentle and a little lost without his mother, was easy to steer. They married after 14 months. I gave a toast at the wedding and meant every word of it. I wanted to like her. I tried. The first sign was small. Keith missed Christmas that year because Renata's family was in Kelowna and it made more sense to go there. Fine. The second sign was medium-sized. They stopped returning calls promptly. Fine. People get busy. The third sign was the one that told me the shape of what was happening. I had a minor heart scare, chest tightness, a night in the Royal Victoria, nothing serious but frightening enough that I called Keith from the hospital. He came the next morning. Renata waited in the car. Over the following 2 years, the distance grew in the way that distance grows when it is being managed by someone who knows exactly what they are doing, gradually, with plausible explanations. Until one day you realize that you have not actually spoken to your son in 6 weeks, and the last time you saw him in person was at a birthday dinner where Renata spent the whole evening on her phone. I tried bringing it up with Keith directly. He said I was being sensitive. He said Renata found me difficult. He said, with the particular exhaustion of a man who has heard something many times, that I needed to respect their boundaries. I did not know what boundary I had crossed. I was never able to find out. The call that ended things came on a Tuesday in February. Keith's voice was flat in the way that voices are flat when someone is reading from a script they have rehearsed. He said that he and Renata had decided they needed space. He said the relationship had become stressful. He said they would be in touch when they were ready. I sat in my kitchen after he hung up and looked at the salt shaker on my table for what felt like a very long time. That was 11 years ago. In those 11 years, I sold my company. I had a good offer from a larger regional supplier who wanted the client list and the warehouse, and I took it. The number was better than I had expected. I was careful with it. GICs, a balanced portfolio through my bank, a rental property in Barrie that I managed myself. I was not flashy about any of it. I lived in the same house I had lived in since Keith was in primary school. I shoveled my own driveway. I took a fishing trip to Algonquin every September with my old friend Douglas, who had been my accountant for 20 years and was the person I trusted most in the world. I did not hear from Keith during those 11 years, not on my birthday, not at Christmas. Not when I had a hip replaced at 63 and spent 6 weeks on a cane. Douglas knew because I had told him, and he never made a big thing of it, which is exactly what I needed from him. I also had a granddaughter, Sophie. I knew about her because Douglas had heard it from someone, and because I had looked once at Keith's Facebook profile before he made it private. She was born when I was 57. I had never met her. I carried that fact with me every single day like a stone in my coat pocket. The Muskok cottage was not an extravagance for its own sake. I had always wanted a place on the water. Sandra had wanted it too. We used to talk about it. A proper dock, a canoe, mornings with coffee watching the mist come off the lake. Buying it felt like keeping a promise to her that I had let go unkempt for too long. It was a 4-bedroom place on a good lake near Gravenhurst, on 3 acres with a boathouse and a dock that needed some work. I hired a carpenter from town to fix the dock. I fixed the boathouse myself over the summer, which was good for my back and good for my head. I told very few people about the purchase. Douglas knew. My neighbor Pauline in Barrie knew, because she fed my cat when I was up there. That was about it. I was not hiding it. I simply did not have a large circle, and I had learned over the years that the quieter you kept your life, the less there was for other people to form opinions about. It was Douglas who told me that Keith and Renata had separated. He had heard it through a chain of Barrie connections. I filed the information carefully and did not let myself feel too much about it too quickly. These things happen. It did not immediately change anything. I went back to Muskoka the following weekend and split firewood for 3 hours and felt moderately better about everything in general. What I did not expect was the phone call 6 weeks later. It was a Saturday morning in October. I was at the cottage. The number came up as Keith's, and I stood in my kitchen holding the phone through 4 rings before I answered it. His voice was different from the last time, less flat, more uncertain. He said my name. He said he had been thinking about me. He asked if I was doing all right. I said I was doing well. I asked how he was. He said he'd had a rough year. He said some things had changed. He said he wondered if maybe we could see each other sometime. I said that would be fine. I gave him the address of the cottage. I told him I was up there most weekends and to come whenever he wanted. I kept my voice even throughout. I had spent 11 years practicing keeping my voice even. He showed up 3 weeks later on a Friday afternoon. He was thinner than I remembered. His hair had gray in it now. He stood at the end of the driveway with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the cottage and the lake behind it for a moment before he saw me on the porch. We sat on the dock for most of that first evening. He did most of the talking. He told me about the separation, about the apartment he was renting in Newmarket, about the job he had been at for 4 years doing operations management for a logistics company. He told me about Sophie. She was 11. She liked horses and astronomy and did not like group projects at school. He took out his phone and showed me a picture, and I looked at it longer than was probably comfortable for either of us. I did not ask about the 11 years yet. I wasn't ready, and I didn't think he was either. He came back the following weekend, and the one after that. By November, we had settled into something that felt cautiously like what we used to be. Not exactly the same, because you cannot erase 11 years, but something real. He helped me winterize the dock. I made chili, and we watched the Leafs lose the way they do, and I teased him about his playoff predictions the same way I used to when he was in high school, and he laughed, which was the first time I had heard him laugh in over a decade. It was on a cold Sunday in December that he told me about Renata. I had suspected some of it. The full shape of it was worse than I had expected, and I had expected something fairly bad. Renata had been running a home renovation business for the past several years. Keith had co-signed a substantial loan for it, close to $180,000, which was money he could not afford to lose. The business had struggled. She had been drawing from a line of credit secured against their house in a way that Keith had not fully understood until the separation triggered a financial review. There were also, according to Keith, some irregularities with how money had moved between the business account and a personal account that her parents had access to. A lawyer had used the word fraud in a preliminary conversation, though Keith did not know yet if it would go further than that. He was in real trouble. Not catastrophic, but serious, the kind of trouble that takes years and a lot of legal fees to work through, and which shadows every other decision you make in the meantime. And then, carefully, he told me about Sophie. Renata had primary custody. Sophie was living with her in the old house. Keith had access on alternating weekends. But he was worried. Renata's mental state had been erratic since the separation. Not dangerous, he said, but unpredictable. She had pulled Sophie out of her writing lessons without explanation and then re-enrolled her 2 months later. She had canceled 2 of Keith's access weekends, citing things that did not quite hold together when he looked at them carefully. There had been a conversation between Sophie and her school counselor that the counselor had flagged, though Keith did not know the details yet, because Renata had engaged a lawyer who was disputing the school's right to share the information with him. I listened to all of this without interrupting. When he was done, I refilled both our coffees and I said, quietly, that I thought he needed a good family lawyer and that I wanted to help pay for one. He started to say he couldn't accept that. I told him not to be foolish. I told him that money sitting in an account does not have a purpose, but that money spent making sure his daughter is safe has a very clear one. He was quiet for a while, and then he nodded, and I could see it cost him something to accept it, which told me more about him than anything he had said all evening. The lawyer's name was Brenda, a woman who came recommended by Douglas's colleague and who had, according to Douglas, a reputation for being extremely thorough and completely impossible to rattle. I liked her immediately. She had the kind of directness that you only get from someone who has stopped caring what people think of them and started caring only whether the outcome is right. What Brenda found, once she began looking properly, was not small. The irregularities with the renovation business were real. The money that had moved to the personal account, and from there, it appeared, to an account in Renata's mother's name, totaled something close to $40,000 over 14 months. There was also a life insurance policy on Keith that Renata had taken out shortly before the separation, naming herself as sole beneficiary for a sum that Brenda described, with characteristic understatement, as not modest. Keith had not known about the policy. He had signed the paperwork during a period when, he said, Renata had handled most of the household administration and he had trusted her to manage it. There was also the question of Sophie's counselor. The details, once the legal dispute was resolved and the records released, were not what Renata had characterized them as. The counselor had raised concerns, not about Keith but about the household environment, about money stress and instability, about Sophie describing Renata's boyfriend, who had apparently been in the picture for several months while Keith and Renata were still married, as someone who scared her. I will not go into everything that followed, because some of it is still private and some of it belongs to Keith and Sophie more than to me. What I will say is that Brenda was worth every dollar, and then some. By the spring, Keith had primary custody on a temporary order with a full custody hearing scheduled. The fraud investigation was being handled by a separate lawyer working alongside Brenda, and the Crown had received a referral from the financial investigator that Brenda had engaged. Renata had, at some point in February, apparently become aware that things were not going the way she had expected. I know this because Keith told me, and Keith knew because his lawyer had received a letter from Renata's lawyer that was, by all accounts, considerably less confident in tone than her previous correspondence had been. Sophie came to the cottage for the first time in March. She was 11 years old, and she had her father's eyes and her grandmother, Sandra's stubborn chin. And she stood on the dock in her winter coat, looking out at the ice on the lake with an expression that I recognized. The same expression Keith had worn as a child when he was trying very hard to seem unimpressed by something that was actually impressing him considerably. I showed her the boathouse. I explained at some length why the dock had needed new cross members and what kind of wood I had used and why. She listened with more attention than most adults gave me. She asked whether the ice on the lake was strong enough to walk on, and I said not anymore, not this late in the season, but I would teach her to skate on it in January if she wanted to come back in the winter. She said she would think about it. She came back in June with a sleeping bag and a request to sleep on the screened porch, which I permitted. She came back in August with a friend from school, and the two of them kayaked the whole length of the lake and back, which they were not entirely supposed to do unsupervised. And I chose not to make a large issue of it because they were careful and the weather was good, and some things matter less than other things. I am not going to tell you that everything was simple after that. The custody hearing was hard. There were days that Keith called me late at night, and I could hear the exhaustion in him, and all I could do was stay on the phone. There were weeks when the legal process moved at a pace that felt designed to destroy your will to continue. Renata's lawyer made arguments that were, in Brenda's professional opinion, creative. The insurance policy became a significant piece of evidence. The fraud case moved to a point where Renata accepted a repayment agreement in exchange for avoiding a criminal charge, which was not the outcome Keith would have chosen, but which Brenda said was the realistic one, given the amounts involved and the difficulty of proof. What I think about when I sit on the dock in the evenings now and watch the light on the water is the 11 years. I have made a certain peace with them, because I had to, because holding on to the anger at that scale costs more than I can afford to spend. But I think about them. I think about the Christmas mornings, and the birthdays, and the hip replacement, and the loon calls on the lake that Sandra never got to hear. I think about Sophie, at 11, already so careful and so watchful, already so practiced at being fine in situations that were not fine. I do not know exactly what Renata told Keith about me during those years. He has told me some of it, that I was controlling, that I had been unkind to her in ways she had confided to him privately, that I represented a dynamic from his childhood that he needed distance from. None of it was true, or at least none of it was recognizable to me. But I understand now that it did not need to be true. It only needed to be repeated consistently until it felt true. And Renata was very patient. Keith and I talked about this properly once. It was a summer evening on the dock, after Sophie had gone to bed. He had a beer. I had my coffee. He started talking, and I let him go without interrupting, and at the end he said he was sorry. And I said I knew, and we sat there for a while in the kind of quiet that is not uncomfortable, but just honest. Two men at the end of a long road, figuring out where to go from there. Douglas came up to the cottage in September, as he always does, and we fished for 2 days and barely caught anything, as is also traditional. He asked how things were going with Keith, and I said better. He asked about Sophie, and I told him about the kayaking incident, and he laughed in the particular way he has when he thinks I have been too lenient with someone, which is a fair criticism and one I accept. Sophie came up in January, as I had promised. The ice was good that year, thick and clear, the kind you don't see every winter on Muskok lakes. I dug out the old skates I had not worn in 15 years, and we went out in the middle of the afternoon when the light was flat and bright, and she fell down 4 times and got up all 4 times without a word of complaint, which did not surprise me at all by that point. At some point near the end of the afternoon she skated up beside me, and we went around the far end of the lake together, in silence for a while. And then she said, without looking at me, that her dad had told her I built the dock myself. I said most of it. The carpenter had done the main frame. She said she wanted to learn how to do stuff like that. I said I would teach her whatever she wanted to learn. There was a lot to know. We had time. She didn't say anything else. She just skated ahead of me toward the boathouse, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. And I watched her go and thought about Sandra, and about the loons, and about how long it had taken to get here, and how strange it was that quiet could feel, after all of it, like the most valuable thing a person could own. I think about the ice a lot. That January afternoon with Sophie, the 2 of us going slow circles on a Muskok lake that her grandmother never got to see. I come back to that image more than any other when I try to make sense of everything that happened. Not the legal victories. Not the moment Brenda told me the fraud case had gone as far as it was going to go. Just Sophie, falling down 4 times, getting up 4 times, not saying a word about it. There is something in that image that explains more than I can say directly. I have spent a long time thinking about what went wrong and what went right in my life, and I keep arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. The things that nearly destroyed our family were not dramatic. They were quiet. Renata did not show up one day and announced that she intended to isolate my son from his father. She was patient. She repeated things consistently until they felt true. She moved money in amounts small enough that Keith did not notice for years. She made decisions that seemed reasonable in isolation, and only revealed their shape when you laid them side by side. That kind of harm requires a particular intelligence, and I say that without admiration, only recognition. It takes a clear head to do damage that slowly. What Keith lacked for too long was not love or decency. He had both of those. What he lacked was the willingness to look carefully at the people closest to him and ask hard questions about what he was actually seeing versus what he was being told. That is not a moral failure so much as a failure of attention. The kind that happens when life is busy and trust feels easier than scrutiny. I understand it. I had my own blind spots during those years. I kept waiting for things to resolve themselves instead of finding a way to reach through whatever wall had been built between us. I told myself I was respecting his choices. Maybe I was also protecting myself from a conversation I didn't know how to start. What pulled us back? What pulled Sophie through was something simpler and harder than any strategy. Keith, when he finally looked clearly at what was happening to his daughter, did not look away. That took more courage than I think he gets credit for, because by then he had already lost a great deal, and the prospect of losing more was real. He hired Brenda anyway. He answered every question honestly. He showed up to every appointment and every hearing and every difficult conversation, and he kept showing up even when the process was grinding and the outcomes were uncertain. That kind of steadiness, maintained over months and years without guarantee of reward. I don't know a better word for it than character. And Douglas. 20 years of Tuesday morning phone calls. A man who never once made me feel pathetic for grieving a relationship with my own son. The quiet ones in your life are the ones who keep you standing. I am 67 years old. I have a granddaughter who wants to learn how to replace duckboards and skates without complaining when she falls. I have a son who calls me on Sundays now, not because he needs something, but because it has become the habit of our weeks. I have a cottage on a good lake, and in September the loons are loud in the mornings. What I know from the long way around is that decency accumulates the same way damage does, quietly, over time, in amounts too small to notice until you look back and see what they have built. Sophie is going to be fine. Not because everything worked out, but because she learned early how to get back up.